Somewhere out past the edge of every star chart worth trusting, there is a graveyard that isn't supposed to talk back. 300 derelict warships, drifting in a slow, silent orbit around a dead star, cold as the vacuum around them, catalogued decades ago as wreckage and never once revisited. Nobody expected an answer from that graveyard. Nobody expected anything from it at all, which is exactly why a routine deep space listening post nearly dismissed the signal the night everything changed. An old, dead frequency, encrypted with a protocol so ancient it wasn't even in the archives anymore, coming from a fleet that every child in the quadrant had grown up being told no longer existed. Not an echo, not a malfunction, active. And when the first ship to investigate finally got close enough to hail it, what answered back wasn't a ghost, and it certainly wasn't finished fighting a war everyone else assumed had ended centuries ago. What happened next didn't just rattle one listening post or one nervous diplomat. It cracked open a secret an entire galaxy had spent 300 years quietly agreeing not to look at too closely. And by the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly why some fleets never really stand down, and why the loneliest soldier in the galaxy might also be the most dangerous one still holding a line nobody remembered was there. The listening post on Kestvarath's outer moon had monitored dead frequencies for 11 standard years without incident. Technician Iso Bren was 3 hours from the end of her shift when the anomaly crossed her console. It arrived the way most disasters do, quietly, buried in a wall of routine static that any exhausted operator could have missed. A signal so old its encryption protocols weren't even cataloged in the current archive. She had to reach back into the historical database to find a match at all. And when the match finally resolved on her screen, her hands went cold before her mind fully caught up with what she was reading. Terran Union Naval Identification, Friend or Foe Registry, TUS Kentaurus, status, active. Active, not wreckage, not an echo bouncing off a dead hulk for 3 centuries. Active. Iso's hands were shaking as she flagged the signal for priority review, because everyone in the quadrant had grown up on the exact same bedtime story. The Terran Union was gone. Humanity was gone, erased in the final years of the human wars, its homeworld's coordinates wiped from every star chart by treaty, by fear, by the unspoken agreement of a galaxy that had watched one species nearly burn everything down rather than lose. She ran the signal against every archived match twice more before she trusted herself to call it in, terrified in equal measure of being wrong and of being right. Her shift supervisor, a weary Thren named Korath who had spent 9 years listening to nothing but the low hiss of dead space, took one look at the readout and went very quiet. "You're certain of the registry match," he said, not quite a question. 99% confidence, Iso said. "It's not degraded static bouncing off debris. The frequency is clean. Something down there is actively generating it right now while we're standing here talking about it." Korath didn't answer immediately. He reached over silently and locked the listening post's outer relay, cutting the signal off from anything but the most secure priority channel available to them. "Then we are not the ones who get to decide what happens next," he said finally. "But God help whoever they send to go look." Within 6 hours, the Sovereign Assembly had convened an emergency session, its chamber filling with delegates roused from sleep across a dozen worlds. None of them quite believing the summons was serious, until they saw the raw sensor data projected above the central podium for themselves. The debate that followed lasted the better part of 6 hours, and it split along lines that would prove uncomfortably familiar in the weeks to come. One faction argued for immediate, overwhelming military response. A fleet dispatched not to make contact, but to neutralize whatever threat the old signal represented before it could act. Another argued for total avoidance, sealing the coordinates permanently and adding the moon to the same quiet catalog of places the Assembly had simply agreed, centuries ago, not to look at too closely. It was a quieter voice from a junior delegate nobody expected to carry the room that finally shifted the debate. "We built our entire relationship with the unknown on assumption," she said. "We assumed extinction because extinction was convenient. If we're wrong about that, sending a warfleet to a signal we don't understand is how a mistake becomes a massacre. Send someone who can ask a question first." It was not a popular position in a room still trembling with 3 centuries of inherited fear, but it carried in the end by a margin narrow enough that the recording of the vote would later be studied in political science curricula across a dozen worlds. Within 12 hours of the original signal, a decision was made, not to attack, not yet, but to look. A single diplomatic cruiser, the Aurelian Accord, crewed by a mixed Threnvashti delegation known for careful, unprovocative first contacts, was dispatched to the coordinates. Captain Vale of the Accord did not believe the sensor readings until she saw the ship herself, hanging silent at the edge of a debris field that hadn't been catalogued in 300 years. The Kentaurus was scarred, hull plating scorched black in long streaks, one engine cell patched with metal that didn't match the original alloy, sensor arrays crusted with micrometeorite damage nobody had bothered to repair. It looked like a ghost that had forgotten to stop moving. But its weapons were hot. Every scan came back the same. Full power to shields, targeting arrays cycling in slow, deliberate sweeps. Whatever was aboard that ship wasn't derelict. It was awake, and it was watching them the way a soldier watches a tree line for movement. "Send the hail," Vale ordered. Her exo, a Thren officer named Oskadiri, hesitated. "Captain, if that vessel still considers itself at war, then we'll be the first to find out what that means." Vale's voice didn't waver, though her claws tapped an anxious rhythm against her armrest. 300 years. Either there's nobody left alive on that ship, or there's someone who has been alone out here longer than our entire diplomatic service has existed. Both possibilities terrify me. She looked at Oskadiri steadily. "Send the hail." The silence stretched 4 full minutes, long enough that half the bridge crew had quietly begun composing what they'd tell the Assembly if the Kentaurus opened fire without warning. Then, static. A voice, distorted by a translation matrix decoding a language it had never been trained on, forced to guess at grammar structures 3 centuries out of date. "Unidentified vessel. You are inside a restricted defense perimeter. Identify yourself or be fired upon." Human, unmistakably, impossibly human. The cadence of command, the clipped military discipline, the exhaustion buried just beneath the surface of a voice that had clearly given this exact warning 1,000 times before and expected, this time, to have to follow through. Vale exhaled slowly. On her monitor, the ship's registry data continued scrolling. Crew complement, last confirmed action. Commanding officer, Fleet Commander Ayanna Ray. Terran Union 3rd Rear Guard Fleet. Final orders received. Hold the line, await recall. 300 years, and someone was still holding the line. "This is Captain Vale of the diplomatic vessel Aurelian Accord, representing the Sovereign Assembly," she said carefully, choosing every word like she was diffusing something. "We mean no hostile intent. We request permission to open communications." Another pause, shorter this time. "Sovereign Assembly," the voice repeated, and there was something underneath the words now. Confusion, maybe, or suspicion. Unfamiliar designation. State your relationship to the Kalen Directorate. Vale glanced at Oskadiri. Neither of them recognized the name. Whatever the Kalen Directorate had been, it wasn't in any history the Assembly still taught. I don't know that name, Vale admitted. Commander Ray, I think you should know how long you've been out here. The silence that followed was the longest yet, and somewhere in it, Vale understood that she was not just making first contact with a lost ship. She was about to tell someone that everyone they had ever known was dead. Yana Ray had not slept in 11 hours, which was nothing unusual. Command rotations aboard the Kentaurus ran brutal during contact scenarios, and this was the strangest contact scenario of her career. An alien vessel unlike anything in the Directorate's known order of battle, hailing her with a designation she'd never heard, and a diplomatic tone that felt almost rehearsed, as though they expected her to be dangerous. Good, she thought grimly, they should. She stood at the center of the Kentaurus's cramped bridge, the low hum of overtaxed systems vibrating up through the deck plating, studying the tactical display. The alien ship, the Aurelian Accord, wasn't powering weapons, wasn't maneuvering for advantage. It was simply sitting there, broadcasting on an open channel, waiting. That wasn't Directorate doctrine. The Kalen never waited for anything. Helm, keep us angled for a full broadside if they twitch wrong, Ray said quietly. Lieutenant Osai reopened the channel. The image that resolved on her screen made Ray's breath catch, though she kept her face iron, still out of decades of habit. The being on the other end was nothing like the Kalen, tall, silver-scaled, calm in a way that read as diplomatic rather than predatory. Behind her, more of the same species, ND another Ray didn't recognize at all, moving through a ship interior gleaming with technology that looked decades, maybe centuries, beyond anything Ray had access to. Captain Vale, Ray said, matching the alien's careful tone with one of her own. You said you'd tell me how long I've been out here. I'm listening. Vale's expression, if Ray was reading an alien face correctly at all, softened into something like pity, and Ray hated it immediately. Commander Ray, the conflict you remember, the human wars, we call them in our histories, ended approximately 311 years ago by our best calculation of your calendar. The bridge went silent. Somewhere behind Ray, she heard Ensign Tor's sharp intake of breath, the soft scrape of a boot shifting weight. 311 years. That was not possible. Her last clear memory before the final cryo-rotation was the retreat from Kamia's station, the order from Fleet Command to hold position at the edge of Directorate space and await further instruction. Ray had woken from that rotation 4 times since. Each time the same silence on all channels, the same absence of a recall order. She'd assumed each time that the war was simply still going badly, that command was occupied, that someone somewhere still needed the Kentaurus to hold this line. That's not possible, she said aloud, and hated how thin her own voice sounded. The Terran Union no longer exists as far as our records show, Vale said gently. Commander, I understand this is. You don't understand anything. The words came out sharper than Ray intended, old training snapping back into place like a shield raised on reflex. You're telling me my chain of command is gone. My homeworld, do you have anything on Earth? Anything at all? A pause. This time it was Vale's Exo who answered more clinically. Coordinates for the system historically identified as Sol were sealed by treaty at the war's end. No survey or contact has been authorized in 3 centuries. We have no current data. Sealed, not destroyed. Sealed. Ray turned that word over like a stone with something sharp underneath. It meant something, that particular choice. It meant someone somewhere had decided Earth was dangerous enough or important enough to lock away rather than erase. She looked around her bridge, at Tor, barely 26 years old by the ship's chronometer, who had never known a version of the universe where the war was already over. At Asa, whose grandmother had died in cryo 2 rotations ago, still believing she'd wake up to a victory parade. At every soul aboard the Kentaurus who had spent their entire lives, some of them their entire lives, full stop, inside 300 years of a war that had ended before they were even born. "Commander," Vale said carefully, "I don't know what to offer you except the truth and time to process it. But I need to ask, are your weapons still hostile toward anyone who approaches?" Ray looked at the tactical display, at the alien ship that had not fired, had not fled, had simply told her the truth, even though the truth clearly cost them something to deliver. "Stand down targeting," she said quietly, and felt the words land in her own chest like a door closing on a room she'd lived in for 300 years. "Stand down, all of it." The bridge crew hesitated a heartbeat, no more, before obeying. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Kentaurus was no longer at war. The silence that followed the order was unlike any silence the bridge had ever held. No alarms, no targeting chimes, no low hum of weapons capacitors holding a charge they'd carried for longer than anyone aboard had been alive. Ensign Tor at her station found her hands trembling on the console for reasons she couldn't immediately name, and it was only later, lying awake in her bunk, that she understood what she'd actually felt in that moment. Not relief. Not yet. Just the sudden, vertiginous absence of a weight she had never once known she was carrying, because she had never known what it felt like not to carry it. Ray just didn't know yet what that meant she was supposed to be instead. They gave her 3 days before the questions became formal, and Ray spent every hour of them in the ship's archive room, rebuilding the shape of what her crew had actually survived. The Kentaurus ran on a rotation system devised in the war's final desperate years, a compromise between necessity and cruelty. With no relief fleet coming and no safe harbor to return to, Fleet Command had authorized an unprecedented order: staggered cryogenic rotation, indefinite duration, crew cycling through active duty and stasis in overlapping shifts, so the ship was never fully unmanned and never fully awake. A skeleton crew of 40, drawn from an original complement of 300, keeping the lights on, the engines idling, the weapons charged, generation after generation, waiting for a Ecall signal Ray now understood would never come. She pulled up personnel files and watched her crew's whole hidden history unfold. Asai's grandmother, Chief Petty Officer Amara Asai, had entered cryo 60 years into the patrol and never come out. Her rotation slot lost to a stasis pod malfunction nobody discovered until the pod was opened for a routine seal check. Tor's parents had both served aboard, had married in the ship's cramped chapel during a joint waking cycle, had raised her in the 18 months allotted between rotations before returning to cryo themselves, entrusting her to whichever crew happened to be awake. An entire childhood spent being raised in shifts by whoever the ship's schedule put on duty. This was not a crew. This was a lineage, a closed ecosystem of duty and sacrifice that had calcified into something almost religious. The Long Watch, they called it in the ship's logs, capitalized like a proper noun, like a doctrine. We hold the line until relieved. We hold the line until command says otherwise. We are the last word of the Terran Union, and the last word does not go silent. Ray had inherited command 14 years into her own rotation cycle, promoted after Commander Ewan's stasis pod failed during the ship's 41st waking. She remembered vividly, painfully, standing on the observation deck the night she took the chair, staring out at unfamiliar stars and making herself a promise. She would not be the commander who broke faith with the order. She would not be the one who decided, unilaterally, that 3 centuries of sacrifice had been for nothing. Now an alien captain with kind eyes was telling her that faith had already been broken a long time ago, by people who never told them. The deeper she dug into the archive, the harder it became to hold onto any simple version of what had happened aboard her own ship. She found the marriage records first, dozens of them, couples who had met during overlapping waking cycles, and married in ceremonies performed by whichever officer happened to hold the highest rank still conscious that month. She found birth records for children who had never once set foot on a planet, who had learned to walk in corridors built for war, who had been taught mathematics using targeting solutions, because nobody had thought to bring proper textbooks aboard a ship meant for a 6-month patrol that had somehow stretched into 3 centuries. She found, tucked into a maintenance log nobody had bothered to properly archive, a child's drawing, crude, done in stylus on a data slate decades out of date, depicting a stick-figure family standing beneath something that was clearly meant to be a sun, with a caption in careful, uneven handwriting that simply read home. The artist's name, cross-referenced against the crew roster, belonged to a woman named Petra Osgood who had died in her 2nd cryo-rotation, 60 years before Ray had even been born. Ray sat with that drawing for a long time before she finally closed the file. The cultural adjustment, once formal contact stabilized, proved almost as difficult as the military one. The crew of the Kentaurus had inherited a galaxy from stories older than any of them, and the reality bore only a passing resemblance to what the archive had prepared them for. Ensign Tor, given supervised access to the Assembly's public data networks for the first time, spent an entire off-duty rotation simply reading, not tactical manuals, not fleet doctrine, but poetry, art history, the accumulated cultural output of 100 species who had spent 3 centuries building things the Kentaurus had never once had the luxury of building. They have entire cities dedicated to nothing but music, she told Ray one evening, practically vibrating with the discovery. Not military bands, concert halls, whole populations who have never had to learn to fight. Ray listened to her with an expression she hoped read as warmth rather than the complicated grief underneath it. 300 years, and her crew's entire cultural inheritance amounted to survival drills and half-remembered fragments of a homeworld none of them had seen. It wasn't envy, exactly, watching Tor discover a universe that had been allowed to grow soft in places the Kentaurus never had. It was something closer to mourning for a version of her own crew's life that had never been permitted to exist. Not every member of the crew adjusted as easily as Tor. There was a night, during that same first week, when the fragile piece nearly unraveled from within rather than from any outside threat at all. A junior technician named Dahl, who had entered cryo believing he'd wake to a victory parade, and instead woke to a diplomatic delegation, tried to seize the weapons console during Ray's absence from the bridge, convinced the alien presence was a trick designed to lull the Kentaurus into standing down before an invasion. He got as far as the arming sequence before Asai, who had been quietly watching him for the better part of an hour, put a hand on his shoulder and talked him back from the console with nothing but her voice. You want to fire on an unarmed diplomatic ship that hasn't so much as raised a shield in 3 days, she said, not unkindly. That's not the Long Watch, doll. That's fear wearing the Long Watch's uniform. She didn't report the incident to Ray until 2 days later, And when she finally did, Ray didn't discipline him. She simply had him reassigned to the archive detail, working alongside her, reading the same 300 years of silence that had nearly broken him, until he understood it the way she had begun to. "You're angry," said Vale, who had come aboard the Kentaurus alone and unarmed on the second day. A gesture Ray suspected was either extraordinary courage or extraordinary confidence in her own ship's ability to retaliate if things went wrong. "I'm doing the math," Ray said, not looking up from the archive terminal. 40 active crew, 11 rotations of cryo casualties, 206 souls who never woke up again who died in stasis holding a line that stopped existing before their pods even sealed. She finally looked at Vale. "I need you to understand something about my people, Captain. We don't do this because we're stubborn. We do this because it's the only structure any of us have ever known. Take away the long watch, and you're not liberating my crew. You're leaving them with nothing to stand on." Vale was quiet for a long moment, choosing her next words with visible care. "Then perhaps the answer isn't to take the structure away. Perhaps it's to give it something worth standing for again." Ray almost laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I don't know yet," Vale admitted. "But Commander, your crew held a line for 300 years without orders, without relief, without even knowing if anyone remembered you existed. The Assembly is currently arguing about whether that makes you a threat or a miracle. I'd like to help make sure they land on the right answer." Ray turned back to the archive, to the long, silent list of names who had never woken up, and made a second promise, quieter than the first but just as absolute. Whatever came next, it would mean something. She would not let it be for nothing. The pressure of that promise settled differently on different members of the crew. Asa buried herself in the archive detail alongside Dahl, treating the reconstruction of 3 centuries of silence as its own kind of penance for a grandmother she'd never really known outside a service record. Tor threw herself outward instead, hungry for every scrap of the galaxy the long watch had kept her from, as though the sheer volume of new experience might somehow balance out everything her childhood had lacked. And Ray herself simply worked, hour after hour, because stillness was the one thing 300 years of duty had never taught her how to survive. I found the entry about her grandmother on her 4th night in the archive, a single line in a stasis maintenance log, dated, time-stamped, utterly clinical. Pod integrity failure, occupant deceased, cause, prolonged system degradation undetected during routine cycle. No ceremony had ever been held. No family had ever been told, because there had been no one left awake at the time who remembered Amara, As, well enough to grieve her properly. And the ship's own protocols had simply logged the loss and moved forward, the way it had logged every loss for 300 years, because stopping to grieve properly had never once been a luxury the long watch could afford. I sat with that log entry for the better part of an hour before Dahl, working quietly at the terminal beside her, finally asked if she wanted to talk about it. She died alone in the dark, doing exactly what she was told to do for a war that had already ended without anyone telling her, Asa said, and nobody even stopped to mark it. She looked at him. "I don't want revenge for that, or an apology, or anything the histories would call closure. I just want it written down properly somewhere so it wasn't for nothing, so somebody besides me knows her name." It was Dahl, oddly, who ended up compiling the full memorial record, 206 names, cross-referenced against every scrap of personal history the archive could reconstruct, formatted not as a casualty list, but as something closer to a family tree, generations of Terran officers who had lived and died entirely within the hum of a single ship's corridors. Ray had it engraved, eventually, on a plaque mounted just outside the bridge, and made it standing policy that every new crew member, human or otherwise, read every name aloud during their first watch. The clash wasn't only cultural, it was doctrinal, and it surfaced hardest in the joint training exercises Vale arranged over considerable assembly objection as a goodwill gesture. Assembly military doctrine, Ray learned quickly, was built on centuries of stable peace, rigid command hierarchies, extensively pre-planned engagement protocols, and almost superstitious deference to established procedure. Her own officers had trained in a doctrine forged by desperation and total war, improvised constantly, reworked tactics mid-engagement, cannibalized damaged systems to reinforce critical ones, treated every plan as a starting point rather than a script. During a joint simulation exercise meant to test coordinated defense scenarios, Lieutenant Asa, third-generation Long Watch crew, raised entirely aboard ship, took one look at the assembly fleet's carefully symmetrical formation, and routed half the Kentaurus's simulated squadron into an asymmetric flanking pattern that violated 4 separate points of standard assembly engagement protocol. It also won the exercise in under 6 minutes, a result that generated exactly as much alarm among the observing officers as admiration. You cannot simply abandon the formation, the Assembly's tactical liaison, a methodical Vashi officer named Rail Das, said afterward, genuinely rattled. The formation exists for a reason: coordination, predictability, safety. With respect, sir, Asa said, still riding the adrenaline of the win, the formation exists because nobody's fired on you in 300 years. Predictability is a luxury. We never had it. Das opened his mouth to argue further, then stopped himself, glancing instead at the tactical replay still glowing on the display behind them. 6 minutes, a clean rout, a result his own carefully drilled doctrine had never once produced against a comparably sized force. Whatever he'd intended to say next, he seemed to think better of it. "Walk me through it again," he said instead, quieter this time. "Slowly. I want to understand why it worked before I decide whether I'm allowed to be angry about it." Ray watched the exchange from the observation deck beside Vale, and something in her chest eased slightly, for the first time since the Accord had found them. "Your people are frightened of us," she said quietly. "Because we never learned to be comfortable," Ray answered. "And I think," she added, watching Asa explain the flanking maneuver with the animated confidence of someone who'd never once considered failure an option worth planning around, "comfort is the thing this galaxy is about to discover it can't afford." Vale didn't answer immediately. Later, she'd remember that conversation as the first moment she truly understood what the Assembly's caution might cost them, because 3 systems away, in the dark beyond the mapped patrol lanes, sensor buoys that had gone silent weeks earlier were about to be explained. "Your people are frightened of us," she said quietly. "Because we never learned to be comfortable," Ray answered. "And I think," she added, watching Asa explain the flanking maneuver with the animated confidence of someone who'd never once considered failure an option worth planning around, "comfort is the thing this galaxy is about to discover it can't afford." Vale didn't answer immediately. Later, she'd remember that conversation as the first moment she truly understood what the Assembly's caution might cost them, because 3 systems away, in the dark beyond the mapped patrol lanes, sensor buoys that had gone silent weeks earlier were about to be explained. Not every voice in the Assembly shared Vale's growing trust. Counselor Vithran Das, no relation to the tactical liaison, though the shared name caused more than one moment of confusion during committee sessions, had spent his career building a political identity around caution, and he was not about to abandon it simply because a lost warship had turned out to be less monstrous than 3 centuries of quiet assumption had painted it. You would have us rearm a species we spent 300 years agreeing was too dangerous to contact, he said during a closed session Vale attended only because her testimony had been formally requested. A species whose own commander admits her people fought a war so total it required weapons capable of unmaking planets. We are not looking at a rescue, Captain. We are looking at the reopening of a door our ancestors sealed for good reason. Your ancestors sealed a door on people, Vale answered, not a doctrine. There's a difference between fearing what a species did once, under circumstances none of us have any right to judge from 3 centuries of comfortable distance, and assuming that's the only thing they'll ever be capable of. Das was not persuaded, not that day, and his faction remained a quiet, simmering presence throughout everything that followed, never quite strong enough to force a reversal, but never fully silent either, a reminder that trust, once broken by history, rebuilds slowly even in the face of good evidence. It was that same lingering distrust that nearly cost the assembly everything when the crisis finally arrived. The first attack came at Havern Outpost, a mining colony on the assembly's furthest frontier, and it came with a signature nobody in the current assembly military had ever catalogued, because nobody currently serving had been alive the last time it appeared. Ray recognized it before the analysts finished their report. She'd seen those weapon discharge patterns burned into her own ship's hull plating 300 years ago. That's Kalen ordnance, she said flatly, staring at the tactical feed relayed to the Kentaurus's bridge. Directorate Energy signature confirmed, 94% confidence. Vale, patched in from the Assembly's emergency command channel, went very still. The Kalen Directorate was recorded as collapsed. Internal conflict, roughly 200 years ago. There's no current intelligence indicating. There wasn't current intelligence indicating my ship still existed either, Captain, Ray said. Empires that go quiet don't always go extinct. Sometimes they just stop being anyone's problem for a while. The Assembly Fleet's response, when it finally scrambled, revealed exactly the gap in capability Ray had quietly clocked during weeks of joint exercises. 3 centuries of uncontested peace had produced a military that was elegant, disciplined, and utterly unprepared for an enemy that didn't observe engagement conventions. The Kalen ships, larger and more numerous than anything Ray remembered from the war's final years, clearly rebuilt and modernized during their long silence, tore through the Assembly's first response wave with brutal efficiency, exploiting the very predictability DOS had defended so confidently in simulation. Havern Outpost's distress signal cut out 14 minutes after first contact. The emergency session that followed had none of the careful deliberation of the earlier Assembly vote. Delegate Vashi Ashen stood before a chamber that had watched real-time casualty estimates climb past the thousands, and for the first time voiced the question everyone was suddenly desperate to hear answered. Commander Ray, he said, and it did not escape Vale that this was the first time he'd used her rank rather than a designation. You fought this enemy. You held a line against it for years before your final retreat. What does the Assembly need to know? Ray stood in the gallery where Vale had once argued for her people's restraint, and felt something shift in the room's attention, fear reorganizing itself in real time. From humanity is the danger into humanity might be the only ones who remember how to survive this. You need to know the Directorate doesn't negotiate, she said. Doesn't retreat when losing and doesn't consider civilian casualties a cost worth avoiding. You need to know your current doctrine, the formations, the pre-planned engagement protocols, all of it is built for an enemy that plays by rules. The Kalen don't have rules. They have objectives. She let that land before continuing. And you need to know that my crew has spent 300 years training for exactly this fight, whether we wanted to or not. The silence in the chamber this time wasn't fear of humanity. It was the dawning, uncomfortable recognition of what fear had nearly cost them. "Commander," Ashen said slowly, "what would you need from this assembly if we asked the Kentaurus to help lead our response?" Ray looked at Vale, who gave the smallest possible nod, and felt 300 years of the long watch finally point toward something worth the weight of it. "Trust," she said, "and every ship you can put in the air, because, delegate, I fought this war before. I don't intend to lose it a second time." The next 11 days became, in the retelling that historians would spend decades refining, the moment the galaxy relearned a lesson it had spent 3 centuries forgetting. That desperation, properly channeled, was a technology all its own. Ray didn't wait for the Assembly's cumbersome approval processes to catch up with the crisis. She requisitioned, with Vale running diplomatic interference at a speed that would earn her a formal reprimand and eventually a promotion, direct access to Assembly shipyards, and set her crew to work doing what the Long Watch had trained 300 years of Terran officers to do better than anyone alive: making broken things dangerous again. The Kentaurus' own outdated systems, it turned out, held secrets the Assembly's engineers found genuinely startling: weapon capacitor designs that traded elegance for raw output, shield modulation patterns built to absorb sustained bombardment rather than deflect single precise strikes. Because the war Ray's ship had been built for was a war of attrition, not duels. Oss and a team of Assembly engineers spent 4 sleepless days retrofitting a squadron of Assembly frigates with jury-rigged versions of Terran capacitor arrays, and the resulting POW. Our output made the ship's own designers visibly uncomfortable. "This isn't how the system is meant to be used," one horrified engineer told Osai, watching a modified capacitor bank redline well past its rated safety threshold and hold steady anyway. "No," Osai agreed cheerfully. "It's how it's meant to work when the alternative is dying." The retrofitting work brought its own quiet friction. More than one Assembly engineer objected on principle to modifying systems that had passed generations of rigorous safety certification. And Oss found herself, more than once, defending decisions she'd made instinctively against colleagues who wanted formal justification for every deviation from established protocol. "You keep asking me to prove the math," she told one particularly persistent engineer during the 3rd sleepless night of the retrofit. "I don't have the math. I have 300 years of people who didn't have the luxury of proving anything before they needed it to work. Sometimes the proof is that it kept 40 people alive long enough to find you." The engineer didn't have a response to that. By morning, he was working the modification alongside her without further argument, and by the end of the week, 3 more Assembly engineers had quietly abandoned their objections in favor of learning everything Osai was willing to teach them. Training the Assembly's pilots proved harder than retrofitting their hardware. 3 centuries of doctrine didn't unlearn in a week. But Ray found the fastest teacher was simply putting officers through simulated Kalen engagements and letting the formation-based losses speak for themselves. By the 4th day, Das himself, the tactical liaison who'd been so alarmed by Osai's flanking maneuver, was running his own squadron through deliberately asymmetric drills. chastened into a fast, hungry kind of learning that reminded Ray uncomfortably of her own cadets, decades and a war ago. There was a particular moment, on the fifth day, that Ray would remember long after the crisis had passed. She'd stopped by the simulation deck to observe a training run and found Das sitting alone afterward, staring at a tactical replay of his own squadron's third consecutive simulated defeat, looking less like a decorated officer and more like a man confronting the sudden, uncomfortable possibility that everything he'd been taught to trust might not be enough to keep his people alive. "It gets easier," Ray told him, settling into the seat beside him without being invited. "Does it?" Das asked, not looking up from the display. "You make it sound simple. Abandon the formation, trust the instinct instead of the protocol." "It's not simple," Ray said. "It's just necessary, and necessary has a way of teaching people fast if they're willing to be taught." She nodded at the display. "You lost that simulation because you kept waiting for permission to break the pattern. Real combat won't give you time to wait for permission. It'll just take the ships that hesitate." Das was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reset the simulation and ran it again. And this time, without waiting for anyone's approval, he broke formation 11 seconds into the engagement and won. The counteroffensive at Havern's neighboring system, when it came, was not the clean, textbook engagement the assembly had trained for. It was messy, adaptive, and built on decisions made in real time by officers who'd finally been given permission to abandon the formation. The Kentaurus led from the front, not because Ray believed in glory, but because her ship, scarred and outdated as it was, could absorb punishment the newer assembly vessels couldn't, and she'd rather bleed first than watch anyone else's crew do it in her place. 20 minutes into the engagement, a Kaelan cruiser broke through the Kentaurus's forward screen and put a sustained energy lance directly through the ship's secondary shield array. And for nearly 90 seconds, the bridge lost every readout on decks 4 through 7 at once. "Damage report," Ray demanded, gripping the command rail as the deck tilted beneath a secondary impact. "Hull breach decks 5 and 6, Tor called back, her voice tight but steady, 3 centuries of drilled discipline holding under a kind of pressure none of them had ever actually faced outside a simulation. "Casualties unknown. Asai's team is already moving." Ray watched the tactical display with a stillness that cost her everything she had to maintain, forcing herself not to think about the 206 names in the archive, not to let this become one more entry on that list before the engagement was even finished. "Hold position," she said. "We're the anvil, not the hammer. Let the frigates finish the flank." It was Das, the tactical liaison, not the counselor, who brought the assembly squadron around in the maneuver that finally broke the Kaelan formation, executing the same asymmetric flanking pas. T-turn Asa had demonstrated in simulation weeks earlier, except this time with real weapons fire streaking past his cockpit and real lives riding on whether the timing held. It held. The Kaelan flagship's commander, whoever it was, clearly hadn't accounted for an enemy that refused to retreat when the tactical models said retreat was optimal, and hadn't accounted either for an assembly fleet that had, in the space of 11 frantic days, learned to fight like it too. When the Kaelan fleet broke and withdrew 6 hours later, it was not because the assembly had outgunned them. It was because for the first time in 3 centuries, someone had reminded the galaxy that being unpredictable was not the same thing as being reckless, and that humanity, orphaned, quarantined, and doubted right up until the moment it mattered, had never stopped being exactly the kind of dangerous a galaxy in crisis actually needed. Aboard the Kentaurus, Damage control finished pulling the last casualty reports as the adrenaline of the engagement finally began to fade. 3 wounded, no dead. Ray allowed herself exactly one long breath of relief before turning her attention back to the tactical display, watching the Kalen retreat vector resolve into a clean line pointed back toward whatever remained of Directorate space. "They'll regroup," she said quietly to Vale, who had patched into the command channel the moment the engagement ended. "This isn't over, it's a pause." "I know," Vale said, "but it's a pause we bought together. That matters more than you're giving it credit for right now." Ray didn't answer immediately. She was thinking instead of Petra Osgood's drawing of a stick-figure family standing beneath a sun none of them had ever seen, and of the particular, stubborn hope required to draw something like home when you had never once been permitted to see it. Somewhere in that thought, she found the smallest, most fragile version of the same hope, and let herself hold onto it for exactly as long as the moment allowed. In the days between the counteroffensive and the formal ceremony, a discovery surfaced that never made it into the Assembly's public record at all, though it shaped every decision the Kentaurus's command staff made for months afterward. Among the disabled Kalen vessels recovered from the battle at Havern's neighboring system was a single surviving officer, badly wounded, who spent the better part of a week refusing to speak to anyone at all, until Ray, against the advice of nearly everyone around her, went to see him personally. "You're the ghost ship," the officer said when she finally identified herself, his translated voice carrying something that might have been bitter amusement beneath the pain. "We picked up fragments of an old recall signal 3 years ago. Command dismissed it as decayed static from a dead frequency. I told them it wasn't decay. Nobody listened." Ray went very still. "What recall signal?" "Yours," the officer said, "or something close enough to it that our listening posts flagged the match. We've been rebuilding for longer than your friends in that assembly realize, Commander, not because we wanted a war with them." He looked at her with an expression she recognized uncomfortably well, the particular exhaustion of a soldier who had spent too long holding a line for reasons that had stopped making sense to him personally. "We rebuilt because we heard your ship's frequency still active out there in the dark, and we assumed that meant the Terran Union was rebuilding too. We spent 3 years preparing for an enemy that turned out to be a single ship and 40 tired souls." The revelation landed hard in the command briefing that followed. It meant the Directorate's aggression hadn't been opportunistic conquest alone, the way the Assembly had assumed. It had been driven, at least in part, by 3 years of quiet paranoia about a threat that had never actually existed in the way they feared. A war nearly restarted by an old signal nobody had bothered to properly investigate, echoing the exact same failure of curiosity that had almost cost Kiever Thess and the excavation team an answer 300 years in the making, in a story unfolding on a very different world entirely. "They attacked because they were afraid of us," Ray said quietly to Vale, turning the intelligence over in her mind long after the briefing ended. "Same as your assembly almost was. Same fear, different response." She shook her head slowly. "How many wars in this galaxy start exactly like that? Not malice, just fear left alone too long in the dark, deciding to strike first before it can be struck." Vale didn't have an easy answer for that either, and the two of them sat with the discomfort of it together, in silence, for a long time. The formal ceremony took place 3 months later, in the same assembly chamber where Ashen had once argued that humanity's return was a threat worth debating, and Ray stood at. Its center in a dress uniform that had been mended so many times over 3 centuries, it was more patchwork than original fabric. and she'd refused every offer to replace it. The chamber was fuller than Ray had ever seen it. Delegates from worlds that hadn't bothered sending representatives to any prior session crowded into the gallery, drawn by a story that had, in 3 short months, traveled further and faster than any piece of assembly business in living memory. She stood at the center of it, flanked by Osai and Tor in uniforms as patched and imperfect as her own, and found herself thinking absurdly of the observation deck the night she'd taken command. The same unfamiliar stars, the same weight of responsibility, except this time she wasn't carrying it alone in the dark. She was carrying it in front of an entire galaxy that had finally, after 300 years, decided to look. The Assembly's ruling was unanimous this time, and unambiguous. Full sovereign recognition of the Terran Union's surviving representatives. Formal apology for 3 centuries of severed contact, though everyone in the room understood the apology couldn't undo the 206 names in the Kentaurus's archive who'd never woken from stasis to hear it. And an offer, extraordinary by any historical standard, of a survey mission to the sealed coordinates of Sol, with full assembly resources, to determine at last what had actually become of humanity's homeworld. Ray had asked for that last part herself the night before, sitting with Vale in the Kentaurus's cramped observation deck. "You don't have to go looking," Vale had said gently. "Whatever's there or isn't won't change what your crew already survived." "I know," Ray said, "but Tor asked me last week if she'd ever get to see Earth, not the histories, not the archives, the actual sky." She looked out at the unfamiliar stars, the same view she'd been searching for meaning in since the day the Accord found them. 300 years we held a line for a home we never got to see. I'm done holding lines for ghosts, Captain. I want to know what we're actually standing on. Delegate Ashen, in his closing remarks to the Assembly, offered something Ray hadn't expected. Not quite an apology, but an admission, delivered with the particular humility of a man who'd nearly cost thousands of lives to his own fear. "We spent 3 centuries treating humanity's absence as a problem solved," he said. "We were wrong to believe silence meant safety. We are grateful and humbled that the last ship holding humanity's line chose restraint when we gave them every reason to expect otherwise." Counselor Das did not attend the ceremony. His faction, in the weeks leading up to it, had made one final, quiet attempt to delay the vote on full sovereign recognition, arguing in closed session that the Kalan officer's testimony proved humanity's mere continued existence was itself a destabilizing force in the region, regardless of intent. The motion failed by a wide margin, the Assembly's collective memory of Havern Outpost still too fresh, too raw, to entertain an argument that sounded, to most delegates, like exactly the same fear that had nearly restarted a war 3 years before anyone even knew there was a ship to be afraid of. Das resigned his council seat within the month, one of several officials across both the Assembly and the remnants of the Directorate who found, in the aftermath of the crisis, that the version of the galaxy they had built their careers defending no longer quite matched the one now taking shape around them. The Kentaurus did not stand down after the ceremony. Ray made that choice deliberately, formally, with the full weight of her restored authority behind it, not because the war she'd been fighting had returned, but because she'd come to understand something in the months since the Accord first hailed her ship. A warship didn't have to be at war to matter. Sometimes it just had to still be watching. She stood on the bridge as the ship's beacon reconfigured for the first time in 300 years. Not a distress signal anymore, not a restricted IFF broadcasting into silence, but an open, formal declaration transmitted on every frequency the Assembly's networks could carry. TUS Kentaurus, Terran Union 3rd Rear Guard Fleet, long watch concluded. Humanity has returned. Tor, standing at her station, allowed herself a smile Ray hadn't seen since before any of this began. Not relief exactly, but something steadier, something that looked, for the first time in the ensign's entire life, like the simple, ordinary hope of getting to see what came next. There was a quiet moment, 3 weeks after the ceremony, that never made it into any official record. Ray had gone alone to the observation deck late into the ship's night cycle, and found Tor already there, sitting cross-legged on the deck plating with a data pad full of navigational charts for the Sol serve. Mission spread across her knees. "Couldn't sleep either?" Ray asked, settling down beside her. "I keep trying to imagine it," Tor admitted. "Earth, I've read every description in the archive 100 times, and I still can't picture it right." She looked up. "Do you remember it? Actually remember it, not from the records?" Ray was quiet for a long moment. "I remember the smell of rain before it falls," she said finally. "I remember that. Everything else feels like it belongs to someone else's memory now." She reached over and closed the data pad gently. "We'll get there, and whatever we find, you'll get to build your own memory of it instead of borrowing mine." Tor didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something Ray hadn't heard from her before, not fear, not grief, just quiet, steady anticipation. "I'd like that," she said. "A memory that's actually mine." Ray watched the stars ahead, unfamiliar still, but no longer only a place to hold a line against. A place, maybe, to finally build something worth defending instead. The last human warship had come home. It just turned out home was wherever they decided to make it. And for the first time in 300 years, that decision belonged entirely to them. The survey mission to Sol departed 8 months after the ceremony, a joint expedition crewed by both the Kentaurus and a dedicated assembly science vessel, escorted at Ray's own insistence by nothing more than a single unarmed shuttle, a deliberate statement that this was an act of homecoming rather than reconquest. Ray stood on the observation deck as the ship dropped out of transit at the edge of a system sealed for 3 centuries, and for the first time since her revival aboard a bridge full of strangers, she found herself unable to keep her composure entirely steady. What they found was not the ruin the archive's darkest projections had prepared them for, nor the pristine, untouched homeworld some of the crew had allowed themselves to quietly hope for. It was something in between, a planet scarred by the final years of a war fought entirely among its own people, cities rebuilt in fits and starts by descendants of those who had never left, who had spent 300 years believing themselves entirely alone in the galaxy, cut off from every colony, every fleet, every fragment of the Terran Union that had once stretched across a dozen systems. They had survived, quietly, stubbornly, without any of the doctrine or discipline that had shaped the Kentaurus' own 3 centuries of waiting, but they had survived. And when the ship's beacon finally broadcast its old identification codes into an atmosphere that hadn't heard them in 300 years, the response that came back was not fear, and it was not disbelief. It was relief so total that half the bridge crew had to leave the room before they could compose themselves enough to answer it. Tor was among the first to set foot on the surface, 3 weeks later, standing in a field under a sky she had spent her entire life trying and failing to imagine correctly. She didn't say anything for a long time. She simply stood there, letting the wind move through grass that had never grown anywhere near the recycled corridors of the only home she'd ever known. And when Ray found her there an hour later, she was crying in the particular, quiet way of someone who had finally been allowed to feel something she'd spent her whole life being trained not to. "It's not what I pictured," Tor admitted. "No," Ray agreed, looking out at the same unfamiliar, achingly familiar horizon. "It's better. It's actually real." Years later, when the survey mission finally reached the sealed coordinates and confirmed what remained of a homeworld nobody aboard the Kentaurus had ever personally seen, Captain Vale would still tell the story of that first night. The 11 agonizing minutes of silence before Ayanna Ray's voice crackled across an open channel and asked, with no fear in it at all, how long she had actually been gone. She would tell it not as a war story, though it had certainly begun as one, and not as a diplomatic triumph, though it had eventually become that too. She told it instead as a story about the particular, stubborn shape of loyalty, about a crew who kept a promise nobody was left alive to release them from, generation after generation, in the freezing dark at the edge of a war that had already ended without them, simply because somebody, a long time ago, had told them to hold the line, and nobody had ever told them to stop. That, Vale liked to say, was the part the histories always got wrong about humanity. Not the weapons, not the war, the waiting. 3 centuries of it, silent and unbroken, until the day someone finally came looking and found them still standing there, steady and unafraid, exactly where they'd been left.